Uh, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, sir, we can.
Okay, okay, so that's great. Thank you. So, a very good evening to all of you, to all the participants. Today's lecture is on doing development research, a primer. Though I have been assigned a specific topic to deliberate on today's session, but still I have kept the title of my presentation a little bit from a broader perspective, because I'll be discussing. Definitely, I'll be discussing all the issues which are mentioned there. But still, I have kept the title of my research as doing develop title of my presentation as doing development research, a primer. As we know, the social science research is basically a kind of tool to both understand and predict the human behavior. And the findings of our research, it contributes to the policy making, and it facilitates different sorts of academic deliberations. So for this, what we do, we rely on the information provided by target population chosen for our analysis. Okay, so clearly there are three crucial aspects. First, how to determine or the decide on the target population. Now, this is a part of discussion on sampling design. Second is what information needs to be collected. This is related to the aspect of questionnaire designing. And third is how to analyze the data which we have collected. This is basically related to a kind of data processing, analysis, coding, the topic of my today's discussion. And in today's presentation, what I will be doing, I'll be briefly locate my presentation in the intersection of my second and third question. That means how to develop a questionnaire and then how to analyze the data, because there are certain aspects of data processing and coding which are related to the type of questions in which we are interested in. So that's why it is I feel it is necessary for us also to discuss some of the aspects of questionnaire designing, although I'll not be going into the details of questionnaire designing, because you have a session on questionnaire designing later. I have seen. So I'll be mainly focusing on some of the aspects which are relevant to the questionnaire designing. At the same time, it will also help you to understand the importance of coding. And for another important aspect in today's analysis is that for my part, I'll be focusing both on qualitative research as well as on quantitative research. Okay. And as I am mentioning that if we start with the aspect of questionnaire designing, now questionnaire designing is very crucial and important part of any research. So one obvious reason is that if your questionnaire is inappropriate, then it will mislead your research, it will mislead the academicians and policymakers. Okay, so it is difficult at the same time to think of any specific sort of the guideline to design a questionnaire. And second important aspect why questionnaire designing is difficult and the data which we obtain from that questionnaire is difficult for us to analysis is the fact that human behavior is most unpredictable in nature. People within similar social setting, same level of education, same level of income might give you different answers to the same questions. Okay, so that is why it is very much important for us to understand the nuances of questionnaire designing as well as to know how to process the data, how to do the coding scientifically. And these are some of the issues in which we will be dealing with in today's presentation. So in a nutshell, in today's presentation, my focus will be on broadly on three aspects. First, to discuss the attributes of a well-designed questionnaire, very briefly, as I have mentioned, to understand the framework of developing questionnaire and how it is relevant for coding and data processing, and then to understand the issues related to the data processing, coding, and analysis. Okay, so before going into the details of those things, let me just briefly highlight what are the key aspects of doing research. Now, as we know, generally in the context of any research that may be qualitative in nature, that may be quantitative in nature, we start with a problem, and relate to the problem we can think of an objective, and also we can think of a hypothesis or research question. Okay, although there is a tendency for many of us to conflate research hypothesis with research objective and research question, but we need to keep in mind that there is a different subtle differences between research objective and research hypothesis. Although I'm not going into the details of those differences, but still it is important for you to note. And then the other important aspects which is related to my today's presentation, that is the method. That means the method of data collection. Okay, and then you have to analyze the data, you obtain the data, and then you have to have discussed the data, and you have to highlight the important policy implications. Okay, now regarding the data collection, obviously what there are certain important considerations which we should keep in mind while doing research, because for any aspect, for any research problem, generally what we do, we generally do a kind of sample survey, or we may do some kind of key informants interview. Sometimes we may resort to some kind of focus group discussion. So there are certain important aspects which should keep in mind while doing any kind of, or while before going into the details of any kind of data collection. First, we have to ensure the representativeness of the population. That means your population should be representative of the sample. Second, you should minimize the non-response bias. These kind of non-response biases are mainly observed in many cases. For example, in the survey we generally undertake in the urban areas. Okay, there are many problem of non-response bias, but we have to minimize this kind of non-response bias. Also, there is a kind of coverage bias. For example, it sometimes it may happen that the sampling frame does not include at all the population element, so therefore it will not provide you a very good insights into the research problems in which you are actually interested in. And generally, in order to address this kind of issues, we rely on some sort of survey, and there are generally two methods of survey samples. One is called probability samples, another is called non-probability samples. For example, in the context of probability samples, we all know about the simple random sampling. In case of non-probability samples, for example, we can think of certain kind of systematic sampling or purposive sampling. Now, all these things will be discussed in your sampling related lecture. Okay, and next, coming to the interesting aspect of choosing the data collection method. Now, obviously, here your choice of mode is determined by numerous factors, and the factors are research objectives, the budget of your research, the survey type, and target population. And depending on, generally these are the different techniques or different modes which are available to us. We may depend on the interviews. Now, the interview may be of different kind. It may be face to face, it may be online, it may be telephone. As of, you may be aware of the fact that during the COVID time, many of the surveys, they were actually conducted over telephone, or they use some kind of Google form or something like that. As a researcher, we relied on this kind of techniques. Okay, apart from that, we also have focus group discussion. We also, in some cases, especially those who are doing some sort of qualitative research, they generally rely heavily on some kind of documents or records. You can think of newspapers, you can think of online archives, web pages. Also, there is a concept of observation, and also there is a kind of mixed mode of research. Now, there is a golden, or this is a certain kind of general rule which is available regarding the choice of mode of data. And the general rule is that more sensitive or more personal the information, the more personal the form of data collection should be. This is the guideline we need to follow in order to decide on the particular mode of data collection. Okay. Now, while deciding on the mode, we also need to keep in mind these two biases, these particular biases. One is called social desirability bias. Okay, now social desirability bias means there is generally a tendency to underrepresent any issue which is socially undesirable, or you may think of there may be some kind of over reporting of any issue which is socially desirable. For example, if you consider the case of, say, related to the sexual behavior of your surveyed population, then there is a there is a chance of underreporting of the issue, because many of the things related to the sexual behavior, they are generally considered to be socially undesirable. Similarly, if there are some issues which are considered to be socially desirable, then there is a tendency for the in the context of the survey to get it as the over reported cases. Okay, so this is another bias which we should be we should be careful about. Whether this will be a problem, it actually needs to be addressed within the context of the survey content and the research objective, because as I mentioned, it is this social desirability is basically it is actually related to certain sort of norms. So we need to be very much careful about those norms, and then accordingly we need to decide on, we need to take care of the of these kind of biases. We need to look at some of the techniques which are needed to minimize this kind of biases. Okay, now coming to the aspect of questionnaire designing, because then we will be able to appreciate the challenges which we face in the context of coding as well as data processing. Okay, so how to design a questionnaire? Now, questionnaire designing, definitely we all agree that it is a crucial stage in the survey research process, and it is generally said that a survey is only as good as the questions being asked. And questionnaire designing, why it is difficult? As I mentioned, unfortunately, in the context of questionnaire designing, we do not have any kind of theoretical base which we as a researcher we can follow. Okay, so creating a survey seems easy, but is usually a result of long processes, and definitely there is certain guidelines which I'll be mentioning in some of my slides later on. But now, for the time being, we can take note of this fact that questionnaire designing is more of an art than a science, because we do not have any specific theoretical guidelines which we can follow to develop a questionnaire. Okay, generally the design of questionnaire will depend on whether we are interested in qualitative research or we are interested in quantitative research. Okay, sometimes as a researcher, we wish to collect exploratory information, that means qualitative information, for example, for the purpose of better understanding of the generation of the hypothesis on a particular subject, or in some cases, we may resort to quantitative information. We may depend on quantitative information. In that case, what we aim to achieve, we aim to test a specific hypothesis that have been previously that have previously been generated. Okay, so depending on that, we can have two different types of research. One is qualitative research, another is quantitative research. Okay, this is a classic very common example. For example, if you are interviewing the female head of the households to find out how decisions are made within the family when purchasing the daily essentials, then definitely some sort of exploratory questionnaire they are preferred over the formal questionnaire. Or you can think of in a more general form, suppose you are researching on, say, an issue on women empowerment. Okay, so if you consider this concept of women empowerment, then definitely instead of a formal questionnaire, it will be better if you start with the exploratory questionnaire. Maybe you can think of certain 10 broad areas which are relevant for women empowerment, and then you can discuss those questions with the respondents. Okay, so that is another example of using the exploratory questionnaires. Okay, and following this, we can think of questionnaires which are structured vis-a-vis the questionnaires which are unstructured or the quasi-structured questionnaire. Okay, structured questionnaire means generally we our question, as it is evident from the name itself, that means we have certain kind of structured way of approaching our survey, whereas in the context of unstructured, we do not have a structured questionnaire. Rather, we generally we have a idea about the research, we know the issues or the concepts which are relevant for our research, and then we try to form the questions on the centering around those research ideas or the research concepts while engaging in discussion with the respondents. That is basically the idea of the unstructured or the quasi-structured questionnaire. Okay. Now, having said this, although, as I mentioned, that although there is no theoretical base of how a questionnaire can be designed, but we can think of these characteristics, these traits, these features of a well-designed questionnaire. First feature is obviously a questionnaire is considered to be well-designed if it is meeting the research objectives. Okay. And second important aspect, it should give you the most complete and accurate information possible. I'll give you some examples later on what exactly is meant by complete and accurate information. And another important feature of a well-designed questionnaire is that the questions in that particular questionnaire should be easy for the respondents to respond and also for the interviewer to record, because when you are administering any particular question, there is a responsibility from both the respondent side as well as from the interviewer side. For the respondents, it should be easy to respond, and for the interviewer, it should be easy to record. Okay, because then only it will be giving, or it will be that particular survey will give certain kind of complete and accurate information. Okay, and another important aspect is your questionnaire should be short and concise, of course, without compromising on the range of issues, on the range of topics on which your research questions are centering around. Okay, so these are the basic features of the well-designed questionnaire. Now, how to approach the questionnaire designing? Okay, so definitely there are certain aspects which are very much important. First, definitely you have to start with a initial consideration. That means you have a research problem. Corresponding to that, you have some kind of research hypothesis, research objectives. Then you have to go on or you have to decide on the question content, its phrasing, its response format. In the context of this response format, this coding is very much important, especially those of us who are doing some kind of quantitative research. Okay, and then we need to decide on the question sequence and layout. Why question sequence is very much important, again I will discuss with we will discuss later on with the help of an example why this sequencing of question is very much important in the planning of the questionnaire. Okay, and then we must think of a kind of piloting of the questionnaire. That means we know this is known as the pre-testing of the questionnaire, and if we find that our questionnaire needs certain kind of revision, then we should take the then we should carry out the revision, and then only we can decide on our final questionnaire. So if we want to follow the questionnaire designing, then these are the steps we need to follow in order to plan for a specific questionnaire designing. Okay, now when you decide on the questionnaire designing, then these are some of the important aspects on which you need to deal, or you should deal very carefully. First, you have to define the target respondents. Then you have to decide on the choice of methods for reaching your target respondents. For example, as I mentioned, you can think of, say, doing a face-to-face interview. You can think of approaching your respondents over telephone. Instead, what you can do, there are many surveys in which you may require only the key informants to give you the information. For example, right now I am doing a survey on water user associations of the in West Bengal. Now, water user associations, these are basically the village level organizations which are constructed, which are formed in many of the villages which are water scarce. So in order to manage the water bodies which are created with the help of the World Bank. Okay, so here, instead of now our research objective is to find out the institutional functioning of those water user association. Okay, that means there is the water user association is basically is an institution. So we are looking at how institutionally it is functioning at the village level. So in order to understand that particular aspect, what we are doing, we are actually relying on key informant survey, because here our interest is to understand what is the institutional processes. Institutional processes means, for example, there is one specific requirement in the context of water user association is to convene a general meeting, monthly meeting, where the members, they are expected to decide on the, say, determination of water charges for water use, say for specifying the irrigation schedule, for specifying the type of crops that they are going to produce. Okay, so in that case, what we are doing, we are that this is that one way of, obviously this is not the only way, this is one way through which we are trying to understand the institutional processes, is we are actually discussing these aspects, or we are collecting information on these aspects from the key informants of the water user association. For example, we are we are actually we are actually conducting discussions with the president of the water user association, maybe the treasurer of the water user association, to understand, to secretary of the water user association, to understand whether the meetings are held at the regular intervals or not, what are the kind of discussions which are taking place on those meetings, are the people attending the meetings or not. So definitely you have to, that means you have to choose the method of reaching your target population. But suppose in this particular context, suppose you are interested to know whether the farmers or the water users, whether they are getting any specific benefits from this water user association and the water bodies which are created under this particular project or not. Suppose if our research objective is this, then definitely this kind of key informant interview may not be sufficient. Okay, so in that case, what we need to do, we need to approach the water users individually. We have to design a specific questionnaire for them, and then only we can have information on whether whether the benefits that they are getting from being associated with the water user associations are really making any impact in their lives and livelihoods or not. So that is why this kind of choice of methods for reaching of target population is very much important. Then regarding the questionnaire designing, these are the important aspects. What should be asked? How would questions be phrased? In what sequence should the questions be arranged? What survey layout will best serve the research objectives? How should the survey be pretested, and does the survey need to be revised? Now, although all of these aspects are crucially important for designing any particular questionnaires. You have, as a researcher, we need to deal very seriously with each and every aspects of this of these different aspects. Okay, and then if we can do this, then it will be helpful for us to make necessary adjustment to administrative aspects of the study. For example, it will be helpful for us to assess the length of time of the of an interview it actually takes, and also it will helpful for us to decide on the appropriateness of the timing of the study. Now, these are very much crucial in case of social science research, because, for example, if you are doing a survey on, say, farmers' lives and livelihoods, and if you decide on, say, visiting the farmers during the busy harvesting period, then definitely there is a high chance of non-response bias, because none of them, they will give you enough time to discuss or to answer the questions which you are actually interested in. So these are some of the aspects which we need to keep in mind while doing research. Then what are the survey components? That means in a particular questionnaire, you can think of these broad guidelines. Along these broad guidelines, one can think of doing the different or framing the different question. First, information sheet, where you should clearly specify the research purpose, researcher affiliation, confidentiality, anonymity, inducements, etc. And then you have to frame the questions. You have to specify the questions, which is basically the crux of the survey. Also, you need to collect information on the basic demography of the respondents. Okay, now all these are very much important, because these are also related to very much related to the aspects of data analysis and coding, which I will be again discussing a bit later, just after some of my in some of my later slides in greater detail. I'm just now giving you some broad overview. Okay, now what should be asked? This is another important aspect, because this is very much related to the coding aspect. Okay, now regarding what should be asked, there are certain aspects again on which we need to focus on. First, we need to seriously consider the survey relevancy. All the information collected should address a research question. in many cases, there is a tendency for us to collect many of the information, but after collection of the data, in many cases, we have found that some of the aspects, they are not at all relevant. Okay, so that's why it is very much important for us to concentrate only on those information which should address specifically the research questions in which we are interested in. And if we can take this seriously, then only our questionnaire can be concise, our questionnaire can be short. And also, it will be helpful for the decision makers in solving the current problem. So, survey relevancy is one aspect. Second, survey accuracy. It will increase the reliability and validity of the respondent information. In many cases, surveys use simple, understandable, unbiased, unambiguous, non-irritating words. Now, all these are very important both for questionnaire designing as well as for our coding purpose. Okay, in the survey, as a researcher, we should be careful about using only unbiased, unambiguous, understandable, simple words. More simpler the questions are, better is the possibility of getting good quality responses. Okay, survey design should also facilitate, recall, and motivate the respondents to cooperate. And proper question wording and sequencing is also essential, is also very much crucial to avoid any kind of confusions and biased answers. Okay, now regarding the content of the questions, now generally we need to be very much careful about the distinction between facts versus opinion. Okay, now why this is important? Let me give you an example. This is an example of factual question. Suppose you are doing a survey on, say, incidence of child labor in your village or in your city. Okay. So this is the one hypothetical question. One hypothetical question is, has anyone of age 6 to 14 from your home gone outside for working as a child labor? Your answer could be either yes or no. So this is a factual question. That means factual means that means in your locality, the children who are between 6 to 14, they either have gone outside their home for working, or they haven't gone outside their working outside of their home for working. Okay, so the answer is either yes or no. That means it is a fact. However, if you consider a question which is the contingency question, that means the question which is related to the previous question, that means if it is so, if the child between 6 and 14, they have gone home outside for working, then is it very common in this community that a boy or girl of age 6 to 14 go out for work for earning? Now, to answer this particular question, definitely it is a kind of opinion question. Okay, so if it is an opinion question, then you have to think of a Likert scaling format and you have to use this kind of coding. Okay, so what could be the Likert scaling format? The Likert scaling format is, the answer may be, the opinion may be very common, the incidence may be somewhat common, the incidence may be neither common nor rare, somewhat rare, very rare. Okay, so accordingly you need to code the format, the possible answers in this particular way. So that means whenever you are actually forming any particular question, then you need to keep in mind, in many cases, the differences between these are very subtle difference. I'm just giving one specific example. Now you can think of numerous such examples. Okay, so it's very important for us as a researcher to distinguish between facts versus opinion, which are related, which are embedded in any particular question. There's a difference between a factual question and there's a difference between a contingency question, which is based on some sort of opinion. Similarly, in case of wording of question, we can think of questions which are open-ended, we can think of questions which are close-ended. Now, open-ended question, definitely open-ended response question, it poses certain problems and ask respondent to answer in their own words. That means here we are not providing any guidance, any prompt answer to the respondents to answer to my questions. Okay, now if this is the case, now definitely there are certain advantages of this kind of open-ended question. What are the advantages? It is this kind of questions are beneficial and mostly used for exploratory research. That means which are research which are qualitative in nature, especially when the range of responses is not known properly. Okay, it may reveal in some cases unanticipated reactions toward the questions. Okay, because if you make the questions close ended, then definitely you are actually making the respondents to answer questions only within the choices which you with which the respondents are provided. Okay, but when your questions are open ended, then it may reveal, there is a possibility that the respondents may reveal some unanticipated reaction toward the questions, which will provide some useful insights for your research problem. Second, the good part question, because they allow respondents to warm up, and also another important advantage is that respondents can qualify their answers or emphasize the strength of their opinion. Okay, but there are certain disadvantages, serious disadvantages of the open-ended question. For example, open-ended question, it is a high cost of administering. Second, the possibility that the interviewer bias will influence the response. For example, in case of opinion related question, if as a interviewer, if some bias is already there in my question, then definitely it may influence the respondents to answer in that particular way. Sometimes respondents may find it difficult to articulate their responses. Okay, for example, it generally happens in the context of, say, women empowerment, because in the context of women empowerment, as I mentioned, most of the questions are exploratory in nature. Okay, so this is about personal field experiences, like when we go and when we ask the women respondents, like after, say all of us are familiar with the self-help groups. Okay, and one of the important motivation of the self-help groups is to empower the women. Okay, now obviously there women empowerment is a very difficult concept. So when we go and ask them, like after joining the SHG, whether the decision making in your family, the decision making power within your family has increased or not, so it is very difficult for them to answer. Okay, so if we keep the questions open ended, then we have found out that in many cases, that is, now this is one example, of course. Now you can think of many other examples where respondents may find it difficult to articulate their responses if the questions are open-ended in nature. Okay, in some cases respondents may not give a full answer simply because they may forget to mention some of the important points. And another important point is the processing aspect. That means the data collected in this format, they are sometimes in the form of verbatim comment, and it has to be coded, it has to be reduced to a manageable category, which is a serious task. And I'll be discussing this particular disadvantage in a much more greater detail while I'll be discussing the coding aspect. Okay, but for the time being, what I am trying to argue is that if your questions are open-ended, then since there is a possibility of getting different types of answers, in some cases the data is collected in the verbatim for comments, then the challenge for the researcher is to properly code that responses, and also to reduce those different responses to some manageable categories, so that you can actually make a story out of it. Okay, because at the end of the day, when we are asking the women, when we are inquiring about the women empowerment, we have to think of certain specific aspects, certain specific indicators through which we can actually measure the empowerment aspect of the women. Okay, so this is a very tough task, very difficult task. Okay, and there are various examples of open-ended questions. For example, what things do you like most about your study? Okay, this is definitely an open-ended question. Or what comes to your mind when you look at the advertisement corresponding to a particular product? Okay, or for example, if you go to a particular farmer, and then if you are asking that when did you purchase your tractor, then these are some of the responses which you may have from that particular from the particular farmer. And in that case, it is a challenge for you to properly code these different types of answers which you are getting. Then regarding the wording of questions, we have another different type of questions which are known as the close-ended question. Okay, close-ended questions means these are the questions in which the respondents, they are provided with certain specific alternative responses, and the respondent, they choose one which is closest to their standpoint. Okay, so this is basically the closed questionnaire. Now, obviously, there are certain standard advantages, some specific advantages of using this close-ended questionnaire. One, it requires less interviewer skills, because here, as a researcher, you are not required to uh, uh, to 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 follow the Herculean task of decoding the data and decoding the verbatims and all those things. So it requires less interviewer skills. It requires less time for the respondents to answer, because he or she is actually prompted with certain different types of answers. So it takes less time to answer. These are also easier for the respondents to answer. It provides comparability of the answers. This is the one very basic advantage of the close-ended questionnaire, because if you are if you are keeping your questions open-ended, then there is a high chance of getting huge number of different types of responses depending on the research problems, and then it is very much difficult for you to make it to present the findings in a comparable format, which is not there in the context of close-ended questionnaire, because it is you are actually providing respondents certain specific alternative responses. So there is a, and you are also getting the responses from them in that format only. So it will help for the researcher to provide comparability, to check the comparability of the answers and draw the policy conclusions accordingly. Okay, and also the most important aspect is the responses can easily be classified, and then which actually makes the analysis very straightforward. Okay, however, there are certain disadvantages of this fixed or alternative or close-ended question. First, lack of range in the response alternative, because here we are actually specifying, we are limiting the different types of responses which we are getting, and also there is a tendency of the respondent to choose the most convenient alternative, which might not be the case in the context of closed open-ended questionnaire, because there is a possibility that if the respondents wishes, he or she can think of completely different kind of answers to the questions which you are actually posing. So these are some of the disadvantages of the close-ended questionnaire. Okay, this is basically some of the examples of structured or close-ended questionnaire. Now, for example, suppose you are doing a study on life and livelihoods of the villagers. Okay, now one typical or one hypothetical question could be, is your annual cereal or grain production sufficient to feed your family for the whole year? The questions could be, the answers to this particular questions could be as follows. Okay, one, again, these are very much important for coding also, because here yes is coded as 1, 2 is coded as no, the don't know responses is coded as 8, and no non-responses is coded as 9. Okay, so definitely you have won this particular question. Now from here also, what we see, that if we just look at the structure of this particular question, which is numbered here as C9, it is a fact-based question. Okay, now just look at the contingency question, which is numbered here as C10. The question is as follows: if not sufficient, that means if the answer to the first, the question number C9 is option 2, code 2, then for how many months can your cereal or grain production feed your family? Now this is basically kind of opinion based. Okay, so here also we are actually prompting the respondents to give responses only within these 11 codes. Okay, so in that sense, your both questions, question number C9 and question number C10, C9 is a fact-based question, C10 is a contingency question, which is at the same time opinion, but there is a similarity between C9 and C10. What is the similarity? Similarity is that both are structured and coded accordingly. So if there is answer 1 in C9, the question C10 would not be asked, obviously, because if someone says that the annual cereal or grain production is sufficient to feed his or her family for the whole year, then definitely he or she is not being asked with the question C10. Okay, so this is how generally we can think of a structured question, which is same time fact based, and the other one is opinion based. Now consider we add another question. What is the question? Question is, in case of food shortage, how do you manage for survival? Now, you can keep the question open-ended. You can also keep the question close-ended. Okay. Now, if you just look at the structure of this particular question, it is clear that it is an open-ended question because the answers might be several. And here, depend from this particular study, these are some of the hypothetical answers which the respondents gave. Okay, that means the respondents, they manage by purchasing or borrowing food, they manage by barter in the neighborhood, they may manage by eating out in the place of labor, they may manage out eating out in the hotels, and so on and so forth. Okay, so in both the cases, that means if you decide to keep your to keep answer to this particular question open ended, then definitely you should be careful about making proper classification to analyze the responses of the respondents. And if you want to keep this particular question close ended, then what you need to know, you need to actually look for certain existing empirical study, and then you have to zero on these different answers, likely answers, which are possible to this particular question, and then accordingly you have to code them. Okay, so for example, here definitely corresponding to this definite problem, you can think of different codes. And here another important aspect is that if you decide to keep this particular question close ended and code them accordingly, then there is a possibility of multiple answers to this particular question, because it may happen that a particular person, he actually managing his food shortages, but both by eating out in the place of labor as well as by seeking some kind of humanitarian support or by seeking friends or relative support. So there is a possibility of any particular answer to this particular question, to this question, or there is a possibility of multiple responses to this same question. But definitely what I'm trying to say through this particular structure is that depending on the nature of the question, that means whether the question is close-ended or not, whether the question is fact-based or not, whether the question is structured opinion-based or not, or whether the question is open-ended or not, you can actually accordingly decide on the coding, and then you have to decide on the appropriate mode of data analysis. Okay. Similarly, regarding the wording of the question, it is also very much important, because the ultimate coding of your response of your survey responses, it crucially depends on the wording of the questions. In many questionnaire, we may think of certain kind of simple dichotomy questions. For example, we may be provided with, say, choice of one or two alternatives. Okay, for example, one specific example is, say, you are looking at the people's participation in election. Okay, in say local government election. Okay, so obviously here you will be providing your respondents with two alternatives. That means he or she voted in the last local election, he or she has not voted in the local election. So it is basically a simple dichotomy kind of question. Or for example, in the context of economics, we generally use this question like whether a family is owning a house or not. For example, nowadays, we suppose as a researcher we are interested to know what are the factors which are influencing any particular family's decision to own a house. Okay, so obviously there are many factors. It may depend on income, it may depend on locality, it may depend on, say, the number of family members. There are many factors which are on which the household decisions to own a house will depend. Okay, now obviously here the whether the family is owning a household or not, it can be a simple dichotomy question, because either the family will be owning a house or the family will not owning a house. Okay, similarly, there is some questions which are there, which is basically determinant choice questions. Okay, where you are actually asking your respondents to choose one from among the multiple alternatives. For example, it may be option A, or it may be option B, or it may be option C, and so on and so forth. Okay, there may be some kind of frequency determination question. Okay, for example, you may ask your respondents about the general frequency of or say occurrence of urea. Now this is again very much important for say responsiveness of the elected representatives in our democracy. Suppose as a researcher you are interested to examine whether the elected representative in your constituency is responsive enough or not. Okay, now in order to examine this kind of question, what you may ask to your respondent, you may ask to your respondents like whether the elected representative visit their locality or not. Okay, now here the answers may be always visit, often visit, occasionally visit, never visits. Okay, so this is basically a kind of frequency determination questions. Also, there may be certain questions which are related to the attitude rating questions. Now these are very much nowadays prevalent in different satisfaction related issues. For example, suppose you are asked you are actually participating in a satisfaction survey, or for example as a researcher, suppose you are undertaking a satisfaction survey, you want to know whether the people of your locality, they are satisfied with a particular, say, supply of with any particular public service, for example in transport facilities or not. Okay, now obviously if you are asking, if you are requiring answer, then definitely there are many alternatives. For example, they may be highly dissatisfied, they may be satisfied, they may be dissatisfied, they may be neutral, they may be satisfied, they may be highly satisfied. So depending on that, you have to code these responses of the satisfaction accordingly, and then you have to enter the data so that you can analyze the data, you can know about the people's satisfaction, level of satisfaction with the transport services which are available in your locality. Okay, so these are some of the different types of questions which we include in our questionnaire, and we analyze them. We have to properly code them in order to analyze those particular responses to get a meaningful policy solutions. Okay, and apart from that, there are certain questions which in many cases are known as the checklist questions. Okay, it actually allows the respondents to provide multiple answers to a single question by checking off the items. For example, this is a classic example. For example, you are making a survey of products, of the products which are available in the supermarket. Okay, so definitely when you are actually decide on buying a particular product available in the supermarket, there are many aspects on which you generally consider for before buying that particular product. That may be related to quality, that may be related to impact on the environment, that may be related to brand, that may be related to price, and so on and so forth. Okay, so depending on that, you can think of including or incorporating all these aspects in your questionnaire and code them accordingly in order to make meaningful decision about buying of the product in the supermarket. That means if you incorporate these particular questions in your questionnaire, and if you properly analyze those questions, properly analyze the responses of the respondents, then it will be easier for you to decide on the factors which are most important to factors which are actually most important in influencing the sale of that particular product in that supermarket. Okay, so this is how generally we design the questions, and this is how the coding and the questionnaire designing are very much related. Apart from that, there are many cases which are also known as open response option questions. Okay, because this is basically a combination of close-ended and open-ended question, and since it is a combination of close-ended and open-ended question, it largely eliminates the disadvantages of both the open-ended and close-ended questions. And open response option is a form of question which is both open-ended and includes specific response options as well. Okay, this is another specific example. For example, if you consider what are the advantages of this open response option type question, it avoids the potential problem of poor memory or poor articulation by the respondents. It recording during the interview is relatively straightforward, and there are various disadvantages of this open response option question. For example, it requires the researcher to have a good prior knowledge on the subject in order to generate likely response option before printing the questionnaire. In fact, this is basically one of the tough task for deriving a close-ended question, because in the close-ended question you are actually providing the respondents with certain specific options. Okay, now if you are not very much familiar with the topics of your research, then it will be very difficult for you to pinpoint or to specify the likely responses to any particular question. So that is why it is very much important for us to do a solid literature review before undertaking any specific or any particular research. Okay, now although there are so if I go back to this particular question, that means there are certain questions which are open-ended questions, there are certain questions which are close-ended questions, there are also open response option questions. So definitely there are going to be a situation in which as a researcher you need to incorporate all three forms of questions, because some forms are more appropriate for seeking any particular forms of responses. Okay, but you can think of always a kind of broad guideline in cases where it is felt that the respondents needs assistance to articulate their answers or provide answers on a preferred dimensions determined by the researcher. Then definitely closed questions should be used. Open-ended questions should be used where there are likely to be a very large number of possible different responses, and where one is kind of seeking a response described in the respondent's own words, and when as a researcher you are not sure about the possible answer options. So these are some of the broad guidelines which as a researcher we can follow to decide on whether we should go for open ended questionnaire or we should go for close ended questionnaire, and then we need to decide on the specific coding and data processing technique. Okay, after this this is another important aspect which is known as the question sequence. This is very much important. Okay, now opening questions and questions flow. For example, it is not at all desirable to start with a question just by asking what is your annual family income. Okay, so because if you are asking if in a particular question, if your first question is related to this, then definitely it will not going to work. And also if you should not place the questions which put some sort of great strain on the memory on your at first. So you have to sequence your questions in such a way so that it is easier for the respondents to answer, and that is why this is a specific technique which is very famous in the literature, which is known as the funnel technique. That means we generally start with asking general question before moving towards some of the specific questions in order to obtain some of the unbiased questions. Okay, and also we can think of the questions which are filter questions. That means questions that screens out the respondents who are not qualified to answer a second question. We can think of a pivot question. That means the filter questions which are used to determine which versions of the second questions will be asked. Okay, and also guidelines for constructing questions, because these are also going to be very much crucial for our coding purposes. Okay, so first of all, these are the broad guidelines which as a researcher we should follow when designing a questionnaire. First, it is always good practice to keep the questions as simple as possible. We should avoid complexity. It is the general basic rule that the simpler the questions, better will be the responses, easier for the interviewer later on to analyze the questions. Okay, so it is always advisable to avoid any leading questions, any leading responses. Okay, one specific example, this is one again a hypothetical example. Suppose you are doing a survey on, say, car advertisement, car sales. Okay, so your questions is something like this: do you like the speed and reliability of your car? Now obviously here the question is ambiguous. Why it is ambiguous? Because here the two different dimensions are incorporated in this particular question. One dimension is speed, another dimension is reliability. It is highly possible that a particular respondent is liking the speed but he is not satisfied with the reliability, or in other case it might happen that a particular respondent is satisfied with the reliability aspect of the car but he is not satisfied with the speed of the car. Okay, so that is why it is better to avoid this kind of loaded question. It has to be, your question should be as specific as possible. Okay, or for the matter of fact, say, consider this particular example. Suppose you are doing a survey on the farmers and their livelihoods, their agricultural practices. Suppose one of your answer is, one of your question is something like this: do you regularly service your tractor? Now this word regularly is basically ambiguous. Why it is ambiguous? Because for some farmers, regularly means monthly. For some other farmers, regularly may means every 3 months. For some other farmers, regularly may mean every 6 months. For some other farmers, regularly means once in a year. So if that is the case, then definitely you should, if you are actually making, or if you are actually incorporating this particular question in your questionnaire, then you should also provide the answers to this particular question in such a way, so that, and code them in such a way so that it will be helpful for you to analyze later on. So rather, it is better to avoid this kind of ambiguous word in your question. Okay, or suppose this is a very common mistakes which we generally commit in our questionnaire when we ask what is your income. Okay, now when you are asking some respondent about his or her income, then you have to specifically mention what is the unit. Is it hourly pay? Are you referring to the weekly pay, or are you referring to the yearly pay? Or are you referring to the income before tax, or are you referring to the income after tax? Or you are considering income in kind or income in kind as well as in cash? Okay, so all these are different things, so you have to be very much careful about this kind of avoiding this kind of ambiguity in your questionnaire. Okay, also you need to avoid making assumption. You need to avoid burdensome questions that may tax the respondent's memory. Okay, for example, this is also some kind of outdated question. Now, for example, there are many studies which are carrying out on the after on the impact of COVID on the livelihood. Okay, now there, if you see any such question here, then there is a common trend of incorporating a question like this: how you say, what was your food choices, say, in 2019? Okay, so how many, so in morning what you ate, and what you used to eat, and in the evening what you used to eat. Okay, so now it is very difficult for the common people, for the poor people, to really remember in a great detail their eating habits both in the morning and the evening. It's not very much, or rather, for the matter of fact, how much was the expenditure. So okay, so this is our eating, they may be able to recollect. But if you ask them, like, what was the expenditure which you incurred on, say your food items, which you incurred on your non-food items in 2000, before 2000, before the onset of COVID, before, or say, after the first outbreak of COVID, after the second outbreak of COVID. Okay, so it is not possible for any people, even if you ask me, it is not possible for me to answer correctly what are the different expenditure pattern which we followed before the onset of COVID, after first round of COVID, after second round of COVID, and after in the current year only. I'll be able to tell you. Okay, so these are some of the questions. These are some of the burdensome questions which, as a researcher, we should be careful about not to incorporate those questions. Okay, and also your so these are some of the things, and then you have to think on the piloting the questionnaire. Okay, so usually this is very important aspect which many of us do not follow seriously, but if you do this kind of piloting of the survey, then it will be helpful for you in a numerous way. Okay, now having said this, now come, this is basically relating to the questionnaire. Okay, now, as I mentioned, the questionnaire may be structured questionnaire, the questionnaire may be unstructured questionnaire. Okay, now suppose your questionnaire is unstructured and you are actually dealing with the field notes. Okay, so if that is the case, then how you are going to deal, or how we are going to analyze those field notes. Okay, now, so while doing the field notes, there are again certain key issues which you should keep in mind while collecting the field notes. First, you have to be extra careful about recording the behavior of the respondents, their activities, the events, and the other happenings in the locality, because in that case it will give you some idea about the situation. For example, suppose you are doing a survey on the livelihood choice, or the occupational choices of the say poor people. Okay, now if you go to any Adivasi area, okay, so now you see that they have a specific tendency of them, that they're satisfied with some minimum amount of income. Okay, so if they earn that particular amount of money, then they are satisfied, then they are not going to work anymore. Okay, so now in that, so if you are actually trying to examine the income expenditure pattern of those people, then also you need to keep in mind these particular traits, these particular events. So obviously this is one important thing. Second important thing is that you have to note your feeling, you have to note the reactions and the reflections about the experience, and you have to note your interpretation about what is happening in the setting, because if you note those interpretation at that very moment, then it will be very much useful for you later on to analyze those field notes and to make meaningful policy implications out of that. And specifically what to note, these are some of the important things. These are obviously not the not the these are the general guidelines. We can say that you have to note the date, time, weather, location, the setting, the participants characteristics and activities, your observations such as interaction between the people in the setting. So these are the this will be helpful for you later on to better analyze your data. That means you have to be, and also this is very important in the context of field note. We do not pay enough attention to this particular aspect. That means when you are interviewing a certain group of people, then you should not pass on any kind of judgment while doing that particular kind of interview. That means in no way you can present your views on that particular question that you are asking. Okay, so you have to be as descriptive as possible while posing your questions. In no way you should express your opinion while making interaction with the respondents. So this is very crucial in the context of the field notes. And these are the general tips. Ensure your field notes are clear and understandable, and always use pseudonyms for names, location, etc. Because nowadays there is a huge literature which is coming up on the research ethics and all those things. Though I am not an expert on those particular things, but these are very much sensitive for when you are actually going to analyze the field notes. Okay, then transcribing and reading the transcript. Okay, now this is the mind it. Now when you are actually after collecting the field notes, you have to analyze those notes. Okay, now one thing, the first thing that you need to remember is that these can be really time intensive, because the generally it is said that a 90-minute interview which you have conducted, these may take roughly approximately around 8 hours to transcribe. So what is the way, what is the approach you should follow? You have to re-listen to the audio to fill the unclear passages or to correct the errors. You have to transcribe the non-verbal utterances. You have to deliver what the participants say, and you should be careful about not editing their language even if it is inappropriate. If you need to clarify, then use the within the third brackets, because that will be easier for the reader to basically appreciate your trustworthiness, your trustworthiness in the particular process. And also, as I mentioning, anonymity, participants full names and others referred, they should not be transcript. Okay, that means you should be very much careful about maintaining the confidentiality. Okay, and second last is, when your transcripts are done, you should read them multiple times to familiar yourself with the data. And most important thing, while doing the transcript, beyond your question, you should be always be alert to this particular fact, that what is happening there, what is important, because those important insights, some little bit of scribbling maybe at the time of the interview, you never know that they are going to produce some important insights later on when you are actually in the process of analyzing those particular data. So these are the very basic things. Generally, all of these are very well known fact, but generally this is the way through which we can we need to approach any particular kind of data processing and analysis of data. Okay, now after collecting all these data, now let me come to this another crucial part, that how can I make sense of all the materials which I have collected so far. Okay, now in before any undertaking any analysis of the research, you have to check these three checklists. Okay, what are they? First, you have to ensure that the checklist, they are encoded in the questionnaire form. Checklist, they are employed in the context of semi-informal interview, and you have to also background checklist for occasional reference and to provide guidelines for the research in general. Because if you sure about this checklist, then it will be easier for you to analyze the data. And regarding data processing, there are two important pillars of data processing. What are those pillars? First, you have to consider checking and converting the data, and then you have to consider about the generating metadata. And what are they? Let me describe one by one. By data processing and checking and converting the data, there are four different components which are coming under the checking and converting of the data. What are they? First, you have to check out the completeness and quality of data. And there are certain features or certain aspects of completeness and quality of data. In the literature, by completeness and by quality of data, generally, these are the four aspects which are being referred to. One is the physical condition of the data, readability of the data, audibility of the data, and reusability of the data. That means when you are conducting any particular interview, you need to focus, or you need to keep in mind the importance of the readability, audibility, reusability, and the physical condition of the data. Because if you are satisfied with checking of these issues, then there is a possibility that then there is a high possibility that the data that you are collecting, they are complete and they are of good quality. Second, you have to check the relationship between the data. That means there, for example, in many cases we are dependent on data from interview, we are dependent on data from field note, we dependent on data from audio visual recordings. Okay, for example, say the examples which I have just discussed, the water user association. Okay, so here what we can do regarding the institutional aspect, that means whether the general meeting of the water user associations are occurring regularly or not, whether the decisions related to, say, determination of the water charges, or say use of water, or say irrigation schedule, whether they are discussed properly in the meeting or not. So there are two ways of getting information, as I mentioned. One, you can always go and ask the key informants. That means you can sit with the presidents of the water association, you can sit with the, say, the secretary of the water user association, and obtain the and collect the necessary information. Okay, now there is another way of getting information on this particular aspect. You can also approach the general members of those water user association, those who are not in the managing committee of the water user association, and then it is your responsibility to check the relationship between the data, whether the story which is coming out from those key informants, they are in sync with the story which is coming out from the general members of the node. So there is a huge, it's a really challenging as a researcher to check the relationship between the data from interviews, from field notes, from audio visual recordings, and so on and so forth. Next, another important thing while data processing, as far as the checking and converting the data is concerned, is the aspect of anonymity. Okay, because the level of anonymization you use for a data set depends on the nature of the study, and each case has its unique set of concerns. Okay, so it is always advisable to remove all the identifiers and replace them with pseudonyms where appropriate. For example, suppose you are, say, dealing with, or you are asking with, say, the political economy of, say, water supply delivery in the cities. Okay, if this is the case, then definitely you will be, from where you can get the information about the status of the water supply. The city residents who are actually using the water, the councillors who are responsible for arranging the water supply, the municipal officials who are again responsible for arranging the water supply and so on and so forth. So if you ask or if you approach them, all these stakeholders, to seek their opinion on the state of water supply, then there is a possibility of getting different types of responses. Okay, so while analyzing them, it is always better to think of a way to remove all the identifiers and then analyze the data so carefully, so prudently, so that you can get a story about the entire political economy of the water user, of the supply of water in any particular city. Second, care should be taken to use the same pseudonyms throughout. And lastly, it is strongly advised to delete from the data any slanderous comments. So these are basically the some of the things. Of course, there is a huge literature on the research ethics part, now which nowadays has become very popular. So however, this is for our purpose, for our analysis purpose, this is one of the important aspect which I think I should mention, and here it is, checking the anonymation. And lastly, converting data or transforming data to a format that is appropriate for dissemination. Okay, so it is not that you can just whatever verbatim responses, whatever you are getting, it is not appropriate if you represent them in same format. Okay, so you have to convert, you have to transform the data in a format which is most appropriate for the dissemination. Next important aspect of data processing is generating metadata. What is that? Actually, it is basically the contextual information that a researcher obtains during the processing. Okay, for example, when you are surveying a particular data, surveying a particular, you are dealing with any particular research objective. Okay, so in that context, generally, suppose you are say you are interested in examining the political economy of water supply, availability of water supply in any particular city. Okay, so while you are doing this particular survey, it is not that you are going to ask the respondents whether water is available or not, or how much they have to pay for the water or not. It is quite possible, or generally, what happens is that you also tend to collect information on their location, on their length of stay in the city, on their age, on their sex, on their income, on their occupational structure, and so on and so forth. Okay, so actually, in this way, if you consider this particular example, so what will be happening is that all the biographical inputs which you are collecting, that would be make you easier for you to identify the transcripts, or make sure that the interview and the interviewer names and questions topic guides are put in place. So contextual information researcher obtained during process is very much important for generating metadata. And there are three components of metadata. One is the data list, second a catalog of records, and third is a user guide so that anyone can use this data. This is very much important because as a researcher you are collecting your data. So now so it is your responsibility to also to kind of think of developing a user guide so that later on who will be researching on the same topic, they will find it easier to analyze your data, to understand your data. Okay, so this is how generally we create metadata. And so that means if you consider, if you are in a position to generate metadata, what is the advantage of that metadata? The data list provides the key characteristics of the data. For example, as I mentioned, in case of data which are based on a sample of interviews with individuals, metadata listing would include the date of birth, geographical location, and any other key feature that the researcher has defined for the sampling. So this is very much important for metadata perspective. Okay, now coming to the analysis, this is the very serious part. Okay, and that is why I have kept the title of the slide as analysis, a cautionary note. Okay, because in many cases, when we are seeing or when we are examining thesis or say many research papers, we see that when the researcher is doing a huge or serious say in-depth sample survey. Okay, but when he is analyzing the survey findings, then it is basically restricts only to the description. That means suppose he or she has come up with certain tables and he is just describing the tables. Okay, but the aim of any research analysis is not just description. That is very important. It is the interpretation, it is the explanation, it is the understanding, and possibly the prediction. These are the very basic pillars of analysis. Okay, so when you are doing research analysis, you have to keep this in mind, that your research analysis is not simply the description that you are finding out. Okay, so you cannot say that, suppose you are doing a survey on women empowerment. Okay, now suppose you go to a particular village, and in that particular village, your respondent said that after joining any particular self-help group, he or she is now he or she is now can spend money at his own at will, at will. Okay, so if they wishes to buy a particular, say ice cream, or if he or she is willing to buy, say, stationery books for his or her son, then she for her son or daughter, she can do that with his own income. Okay, now you just describe, you have just described that, okay, I have found out this with found out this particular aspect from my survey. Okay, now unless and until you are actually relating this with the broader literature of women's agency, your analysis remains incomplete. That is why your task as a researcher is not just to describe what you have observed in your field. Rather, you have to be very serious about interpreting that data. You have to provide enough explanation for the data. You have to provide enough understanding of the data, so that you can make certain kind of prediction about the nature of, or the process of, which is very much important, the process of women empowerment in that particular village. Okay, that is why this the graph which I'm going to show is very much important for qualitative analysis, and this is known as the circular process of qualitative analysis. This is what the circular process of qualitative analysis is all about. Okay, so in qualitative analysis, what you need to do, you need to describe the data, you need to classify the data, you need to connect the data. Okay, so now let me describe all this description, this classification, this connecting the data, and how they are important in achieving the research, the fundamental aim of any research analysis, that is which will go beyond description, which is helpful for interpreting, providing enough explanation, even possibly providing prediction of the data. That is why the circular process of qualitative analysis is very much important. That means what I am trying to argue is that in this particular slide, that when you are conducting any particular research analysis, then your task should not only to describe the data, but rather your task also involves classification of the data and the connecting of the data. Now let me describe what actually is meant by describing, classifying, and connecting, because these three taken together actually complete the comprehensiveness, or facilitates the comprehensiveness of the qualitative analysis. Okay, what is description? Description means, now when we consider description, theoretically there is a difference between thin description and thick description. What is thin description? Thin description means you are merely describing the facts which you have collected in the field. But what is thick description? If you consider the thick description, then thick description includes these three important contexts. First, it will provide the context of an act. It will provide the intention and meaning attributed by the actor to the action, and it also examine the processes in which the action is embedded. Now, just look at the component of these three descriptions. If you provide enough attention to each and every component of this thick description, then definitely the basic purpose of the fundamental goal of your research analysis will be fulfilled. Because if you provide enough, or if you give enough attention to all of these components, then definitely your research analysis will not merely be descriptive, rather it will be analytical, it will be rigorous, it will be useful for any kind, for providing any kind of policy making, policy implication. It will be having enough or solid policy implications. Okay, Now, what is context? Context means you have to situate the action, the research topics in which you are interested in within the social, cultural, historical backdrop against which it takes place. That means whatever data that you are collecting, you have to situate the data within the social, cultural, historical backdrop of that particular survey location. Okay, that is what is meant by context. Intentions. What is intentions? In qualitative research, we put strong emphasis in understanding the subjective meaning imbued by the actors to the way in which any action is organized. That means whatever information, whatever responses that you are getting, you need to be very much careful about decoding the subjective meaning of those responses. Last is the process. Now the process means it is basically linked to that of change. That means here we shift our attention from context and intentions to the consequences of the actions. That means if you are if you are dealing with any particular research issue, then definitely they are going to have some impact on the some impact. Okay, now you have to think of capturing the consequences of the particular action in order to make your description thick. That means as a researcher, your task is not to go for thin descriptions of whatever you have found out in your field. Rather, your responsibility is to go for thick descriptions which encompasses these three important aspects of analytical research. Now, coming to the classification and making connection, because description is one part of analysis. Now, regarding classification and making connection, these are the very important thing. What is classification? Classification means you know, when you are doing any kind of survey, you are actually producing or collecting huge amount of data. Now, to make a story out of it, what you need to do, you need to sort out that huge amount of data into certain classes based on certain characteristics. Okay, then you have to think of developing conceptual framework so that you can relate those conceptual framework with the classes which you have sorted out on the basis of certain characteristic. Then only the picture that you will get will give some kind of accurate representation of the social reality which you have actually studied. And then you have to organize the data into groups which is based on certain characteristics. Is essentially, it is known as the process of categorization. That is why it is said that the classification of the data and the categorization of the data should always be guided by the research objectives. Okay, that means whatever you have, so you have a specific research objectives, you have collected the data, and then it is your responsibility to classify the data on the basis of certain characteristics. Then it will be known as certain, you will be ending up with certain categories. Okay, so classification and categorization, they should always be guided by the research objectives. And making connection means describing and classifying are not end in themselves, but it is helpful to produce an account of our analysis. That means if you are describing your data that you are collecting in your field survey, if you are properly classifying that particular data, then obviously you will be in a better position to make connection with the existing theory, to make a story out of it. And that is why it is said that we have to look for association between different variables and try to see the patterns within the data so that we can discern the regularities and also the variations and exceptions. That means if your story is matching with the story of the existing literature, then it is well and fine. You can say that, okay, what my study is validating the existing research which is available in the literature. And if it is not, that means if you are observing any variations, any exceptions, any contrary evidence to the existing literature, then as a researcher, it is your task to provide, on the basis of your field experience, to provide certain kind of justification why it is varying, why it is making exception. Because, and in this way, you will be able to collect whatever story, whatever field experiences that you have collected, that you have gathered, to link that with the existing theoretical knowledge or existing theoretical literature. So that is why making connection is very much important. And now coming to the last part of my analysis, it is basically the coding. By coding, what we means, because at the end of the data, at the end of the day, we want to analyze the data. Okay. Now, if we want to analyze the data, it is always helpful if we approach that analysis in an interactive way. By interactive way means we constantly ask the question like who, what, when, where, why. These are some of the questions. These are very common. These are, I think, most common, most prevailing in terms of any research, be it qualitative research, be it quantitative research. Okay, so if that is the case, then why coding is helpful? Because coding helps to convert the materials which is there in the questionnaire into suitable code form. Some of the coding I have already discussed. Okay, but as I mentioned, coding is generally considered to be a tedious and demanding job, and at the same time, this is an area where analysis of quantitative and qualitative data, they complement and supplement each other. That means if you are coding smartly, then it will be easier for you as a researcher to mix, to triangulate both the quantitative and qualitative data. And this is basically known as the theoretic. This is basically the essence of theoretical coding. It is generally said that theoretical coding facilitates the development of a grounded theory. Okay, and that is why this particular structure or figure I find very compelling, because if you look at the upper side of this particular picture, it is basically theory means ideas mean what we think. Okay, and then to understand those ideas on which we depend on data means reality means what we observe. Okay, so there is a two way to look at the connection between theory and data. One is from data we can go to theory. That means from what we observe you can go and construct certain ideas. This is known as the inductive reasoning. The other way, the flip side of it, from theory, that means you have some theoretical knowledge, and then you just check whether your reality is conforming to the theory or not. Okay, that is known as the deductive reasoning. In the context of coding, we start with this deductive reasoning. Why? Because if you just look at the different typology of the coding, there are three different typology of the coding. One is open coding, the second one is known as axial coding, and the third one is known as selective coding. What is open coding? Open coding means is referred to the close examination of the data so that the phenomena be named and categorized. Just let me give you one particular example. Okay, now how coding is important and how you actually make classification based on the coding. Okay, suppose you are doing a study on, this is a classic example actually. Suppose you are doing a study on how children play together. Okay, now you can think of three different responses. You can see that one child is grabbing a toy from another. You can see another child hiding her toy. You can see another child avoiding interacting with the others. Okay, that means the mode here is different. One is grabbing, another is hiding, another is avoiding. Okay, now here, apart from these three, you can think of many other possible way through which the children, they may play together. Okay, so if this is the case, now if you now think, now this is the simplest example. Now there are many complex situation where you can think of innumerable alternatives which can be related to any particular question. So if you want to make sense of that, but if you make any sense out of these innumerable possibilities, then how should you approach? You can approach by this way. What you can do, you can start grouping the concepts together as categories. Example, here what we can do, we can think of grabbing, hiding, avoiding to represent a particular category, which is known as strategies to avoid sharing a toy. That means all these can be clubbed under one particular categories. Okay, and this is known as the one particular example of open coding. That means here just we can actually think of a particular category so that we can make a story out of the behavior, out of the children's behavior, how they play together. Okay, because here grabbing, hiding, avoiding, we can club them under one particular category, which is known as the strategy. All the children's, they are hiding, they are grabbing, they are avoiding in order to avoid sharing a toy with the other. Okay, so this is one specific example how open coding is helpful for analyzing qualitative data, which can be very complex in nature. So this kind of classification or categorization is very much important, because if your classification or codification is good, then it will definitely help you in making a solid story out of your complex responses which you are getting observing in your field. Apart from that, another important aspect of coding, open coding, is dimensionalization. Okay, that means the properties which I have identified, they can also be dimensionalized. That means they can be located along a continuum in order to define the content much more precisely. These are, so there are many examples of that. You can look at the different the literature to know what dimensional is all about. But actually, so this is a basic thing. But how we can approach this open coding? Now there are various ways of doing this open coding. What we can do, we can first analyze any interview, any field note, any questionnaire, open-ended questionnaire, line by line, so that concepts and categories are freely generated. And that is why I always emphasize on the importance of generation of good categories, because if you can categorize your responses properly, then it will be easy for you to make a good story out of it. And that is why it is very much important. And then after that, what you can do, you can go paragraph wise or in terms of the entire document or is. So basically, at the end of the day, what is important? It is most important for the researcher to adhere to the core aims of coding. Why we are coding? Because we want to understand the text, the field observation, in order to generate categories which can be used for comparing, which can be used for our understanding the entire socio-economic political realities behind any particular scenario. Okay, that is why it is important for us to understand the open coding. Apart from that, this is the other thing of axial coding. What is axial coding? In case of axial coding, this is basically the way generally we approach. We start with certain kind of causal condition. We identify the causal condition, then we identify the phenomena and context, then we identify the intervening condition, we identify the action and interaction strategy, and finally we identify the consequence. That means you have to, when you are having a particular field note, or you are encountering with a particular interview, that may be in the audio form, or that you may have a record of your audio visual recording. So when you will be listening to that particular record for analysis, then, and if you are following this axial coding, then you have to follow these particular methods, these particular steps to approach the analysis in a much more systematic fashion. Okay, apart from that, there is another coding which is very much popular in our in the qualitative analysis, that is known as the selective coding. Okay, selective coding means it actually try to locate or try to identify the core strategy around which the other categories can be arranged. Okay, now since the main aim of this coding strategy is to locate the core category, there is an advantage of this, that if you can identify that core category, then it will be easier for you to reveal the actual story of the case. Okay, and the coding approach, as you see, therefore is essentially an inductive one. Inductive one means you are taking the cue from the data. From that data, after reading that data, you are actually generating certain categories, and then you are, on the basis of that those categories, you are analyzing those categories to analysis of your entire data. That is why this coding approach is essentially known as inductive one. And then after that analysis, you are trying to fit your analysis within the existing theoretical literature. That is why it is known as the inductive one. Okay, and that is why this is a famous quotation from Strauss and Corbin. which actually valorizes the importance of coding. It says that, let me read it for you, that from studying the content and meaning of the text, the researcher uses his or her interpretative abilities to formulate the code and categories, takes them to the higher level of abstraction, and then construct a story or an account which is applicable to the whole data. The researcher is able to say, under this condition, this is what occurs. So if you read this particular statement very carefully, then definitely you'll be able to appreciate the importance of coding in qualitative research. That means, as a qualitative researcher, those who are doing qualitative research, it is your responsibility. Basically, the entire coding is depend on your interpretative abilities, because if your interpretative abilities are good, then you will be able to formulate clearly the code and categories. And if you are able to clearly formulate your code and categories, then you can be able to construct your story out of it, which will be applicable to the whole data. That means, from a particular sample or survey, you can generalize the data. Okay, that means the researcher is able to say that under this condition, this is what occurs. So that is what basically the idea of, or the beauty of depending on the coding analysis. Okay, apart from that, there is another type of analysis which is known as the qualitative content analysis. Now, content analysis is basically which is basically it sits at the opposite of the coding, because here in the qualitative content analysis, what we do, this is another type of analysis which on which the qualitative researchers depend heavily, but it is different from the coding, the approaches which I have discussed in my previous 3 or 4 slides. And the difference is as follows, because here in the qualitative content analysis, what you do, you use the categories bought from the outside and then fits the empirical material against them, of course after modifying the categories whenever necessary. So this is different from the coding. Why it is different? Because in the coding, you are actually relying on the data, and on the basis of data, you are defining or identifying certain categories. But in the qualitative content analysis, what you are doing, your approach is just different. Here, you are not defining or identifying categories on the basis of data. Rather, you are borrowing your data from outside, from the existing literature, and then you are trying to fit those categories into your empirical material. Okay, and in that process, if your categories require any kind of modification, then you can do that modification. That is basically the approach of qualitative content analysis. And why? And this is precisely why the qualitative content analysis is considered to be different from the coding analysis, but both of them, they are widely used in the qualitative research. Okay, and the aim of the qualitative content analysis is to reduce the material so as to make it much more manageable. And these are the 3 important aspects of qualitative content analysis. One is summarizing the content analysis, where you are actually putting emphasis on omission of less relevant passages. Then there is explicative content analysis. Here you are concentrating on the statements which are puzzling, which are contradictory, which are unclear, and then you try to explain those contradictions, you try to explain those puzzles by keeping in mind the context in which the survey is carried out, or you look for certain other clues which is available in the existing empirical literature to make clear story out of that, out of those contradictory or puzzling or unclear statement. This is the another aspect of explicative content analysis. And the last aspect of qualitative content analysis is structuring content analysis. That means here the researcher, they look for different types of formal structure, and then he applies categories which is emerged at the stage of formulating the research question itself and organize the material accordingly. That means here you are actually approaching your entire qualitative analysis in a structured way. That means here you are starting with a specific research objective, and then you identify the certain categories on the basis of the existing research, and then you are actually trying to fit those categories into the data which you are obtaining from your field node. So this is what restructuring content analysis is all about. So basically, both the coding and the qualitative content analysis are widely used in the qualitative literature, and this is how generally we try to approach the analysis. But basically, what through my lecture of today's presentation, what I have tried to show you, I have tried to discuss some of the important aspect of questionnaire designing, although I haven't discuss the other nuances of questionnaire designing in a greater detail, because this will be taken up by another experts later on in your research methodology course. So but for my part, it was important for me to elaborate the nuances of questionnaire designing, so that you can understand the importance of different types of question, and then how it is related to coding and coding and all these aspects. And another important aspects which I wanted to highlight is that your analysis is not simply merely description, rather it is much more than description. It is basically about your explanation, about your relating to the existing theory, and maybe beyond that, making a new story out of it. Okay, so so let me stop here. So so this is what my today's presentation is all about. So let me stop here, because okay.